No man could approach the Bloodied Stallion. The Barren widow bathed him in the creek. The horse came in at dusk, and nobody wanted to touch him. That's what I remember first. Not the blood, though there was plenty, and not the sound he made, that high cracked scream that bounced off the canyon wall and set every dog in Garnet Springs to barking. What I remember is the way the men held back. 12, 15 of them gathered at the fence line of Harlan Price's livery, and not one of them made a move toward the gate. The horse stood in the center of the corral with his head low and his chest heaving, and wire cuts opened up across his left shoulder, 3 of them, deep enough you could see the layer beneath the skin. He'd gone through a fence somewhere. Hard. And whatever happened before that, out on the flats, had left him with the look of a thing that had decided the world was against him and had made peace with the fact. Price's boy Emmett tried first. 17, good hands, the kind of kid who's not afraid of much. He got the gate halfway open and the stallion turned on him, didn't charge, didn't rear, just turned. Set those dark eyes on the boy and held. Emmett backed out and shut the gate, and nobody said anything about it. I was there because I had nothing better to do. That's the honest truth of where I was in my life at that time. Marshal of Garnet Springs for 11 years, which sounds like something, and maybe once it was. But the town had gotten quiet in the way that towns get quiet when the hard men have moved on to somewhere else with more to offer. There wasn't much left requiring a man with a badge and a reputation. There was paperwork. There were drunks to roust on Saturday nights. There was a county commissioner named Aldous Fitch who liked to remind me at every council meeting that the marshal's salary was, in his view, the single largest waste of public money in the territory of New Mexico. My wife had been gone 4 years. Cancer took her slow, the way it does. After that, I lived in the rooms behind my office, and I ate my meals at Delia Cummer's boarding house, and I went asleep most nights before dark because the evenings were the hardest part, and sleep was the only clean exit I knew. I was 51 years old. I weighed 162 pounds. My right knee had been bad since a fall from a horse in 1868, which was, doing the math, 9 years of it grinding and clicking on cold mornings. I didn't think much about the future. I thought about getting through the day with my dignity intact, which is a different project entirely. So I was at the fence with the rest of them, watching the horse bleed, and after Emmett backed out, I heard Price say he'd have to shoot it. The wire cuts weren't the problem, cuts you can treat. But the horse had something broken in him that went deeper than the shoulder, something in the disposition, and a horse like that on a yard with other animals and with children around wasn't something Price was willing to risk. I don't know what made me say what I said. Old habit, maybe. The habit of stepping in when nobody else will. I said, "Give me tonight with him." Price looked at me the way men look when they're deciding whether to bother arguing. He knew me well enough. He said, "Your funeral, Cord." My name is Cord Hatcher. That's not especially relevant, but it's mine. I went back to my office and got the things I'd need. Carbolic, clean rags, the soft brush I'd kept since before Margaret died when I still had horses of my own, a lantern, a rope, though I didn't intend to use it. I stopped at Delia's kitchen, and she gave me a pot of warm mash without asking why. She was like that, Delia. She understood that sometimes a man needs to do something at night without explaining himself. And I carried it all back to the livery in 2 trips, and I let myself in through the side gate. The stallion watched me cross the yard. His breathing had slowed some. The blood on his shoulder had dried at the edges and was still running in one place, the deepest cut, a thin dark line down into the dirt. I sat down about 20 feet from him and set the lantern between us, and I didn't do anything for a while. That's something men forget. The doing. They think being around a spooked animal means working at it, approaching, offering your hand, making a show. But what a hurt thing wants, man or horse, it's the same, is for someone to simply be there without wanting anything, without pushing. So I sat. I ate a biscuit I'd pocketed from Delia's. I looked at the stars where I could see them over the roof line of the livery, and I talked, quietly, not to the horse exactly, or not only. I talked the way a man talks when he's been alone long enough that the words have backed up in him and he needs somewhere to put them. I talked about the county commissioner and his opinions. I talked about the fact that my knee had been worse this week than last, and I didn't know what to do about that except wait. I talked about Margaret a little, not the dying part, the other parts. The horse's ears moved. He shifted his weight. After about an hour I stood up slowly, and I took the mash and I walked toward him, not straight on but angled the way you do, and I stopped about 8 feet out and set the pot down and went back to my spot. He waited a long time, then he walked to it and ate. I got closer after that, a little at a time, until I was standing at his shoulder and he let me be there. I pressed my hand flat against his neck, not petting, just resting it there, and I felt his pulse under my palm, fast still but evening out, and I thought, there you are. I worked on the cuts as best I could in the lantern light. The carbolic made him flinch, but he didn't pull away. I cleaned each one, pressed the rags until the bleeding stopped, and when I was done, I sat back down and the horse stood near me, and that was where we were when the first light came up gray over the canyon rim. I heard the gate and I turned. She was carrying a bucket and a length of old canvas, the kind you lay under a wagon to keep the mud out of the cargo. She had a kerchief over her hair and her sleeves rolled to the elbows, and her boots were already muddy, which meant she'd come the back way along the creek path. Her name was June Calloway. She'd been a widow going on 3 years. Her husband Roy had died of a riding accident, not a dramatic one, just a horse that stepped in a hole on a flat piece of ground, the kind of death that seems wrong because there's no story to it. She ran a small place 2 miles east of town, 12 acres, a few cattle, a kitchen garden. She was 38. She had no children. The town knew about that last fact the way small towns know things, which is to say completely and without kindness. I had heard Aldous Fitch's wife use the word Barren once in a conversation at the dry goods store when she didn't know I was standing on the other side of the shelving. I didn't know June well. I knew her the way you know people in a small town, her face, her wagon, the window of her house lit up some evenings when I rode past. I had helped her once with a fence dispute 2 years prior. She'd thanked me plainly, no fuss, and that had been that. I said, "Mrs. Calloway, it's early." She said, "I heard about the horse last night. My place is the nearest water with a decent bank. If you want to clean those cuts properly, you'll need to walk him to the creek." She said it the way she said most things, which was simply, without indicating that it might be remarkable to show up at dawn with a bucket and a plan. I said, "He won't go easy. He barely lets me touch him." She said, "Then we'll take our time." And that was how it started. She was right that the creek was better. Carbolic is good for cleaning, but it's rough on tissue, and what the cuts needed, especially the deep one, was water and time, and the natural cold of the creek to bring the swelling down. She seemed to know things about wounds. I asked her once, later, where she'd learned, and she said her mother had been a midwife, and that a midwife's work teaches you everything about tissue and pain and what the body does when it's trying to come back from something. We got the horse to the creek in about 40 minutes. Slow going. June walking at his head, talking to him the whole time, low and even, nothing special in the words. She was telling him about the creek, about the temperature of the water this time of year, about the fact that her own mare had cut herself on a similar piece of fence 2 summers ago and healed clean, just a voice, steady, without urgency. I walked at his shoulder. At the bank he balked, stood at the edge and looked at the water with his ears back. June waded in first, walked right in up to her knees, boots and all, turned around and held out her hand. She looked at the horse, then she looked at me. She said, "Come on then." I'm not sure now whether she was talking to the horse or to me. I think maybe both. I waded in beside her, and the cold came up through my boots, and my bad knee screamed, and I pressed my hand against the horse's neck, and he came in 1 step, 2 steps, and then he was standing in the current up to his cannon bones, and his head came down, and he blew out a long breath. June worked on the cuts from the water side, kneeling in the shallows, the creek running cold and clear over her hands. She worked without hurry. The deep cut had opened some in the night, and she cleaned it carefully, pressing the edges together, checking the depth. She packed it with a poultice she'd brought in a folded piece of cloth, yarrow and something else, I don't know what, and she wrapped it with a strip of canvas and tied it firm but not tight. The horse stood and let her do it. After a while she sat back on her heels in the water, and she looked at him, and then at me. She said, "He'll heal." I said, "Because of what you did." She said, "Because of what you did last night. I just finished it." I didn't say anything to that. I was looking at the water and thinking about the way the morning light came through the cottonwoods on the far bank, that particular thin gold light that only happens early and doesn't last. She said Price was going to shoot him. I said yes. She said nobody else went in. I said no. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer plain." I said, "All right." She said, "Do you have anyone at home?" I looked at her. She was still kneeling in the shallows, the water running over her wrists, her eyes on my face. She wasn't being indelicate. She wasn't being sentimental. She was asking a thing she needed to know, the way she did everything directly, without pretense. I said, "No, not since my wife passed." She nodded. She stood up, water streaming off her skirt, and she looked out at the far bank the way I'd been looking. She said, "My husband's been gone 3 years. The town has a story about me." I said, "I know." She said, "The story isn't wrong is the thing. I can't have children. I made my peace with that a long time ago. But there isn't a man in Garnet Springs who'd look past it. They look at me and they see what's not there instead of what is." The horse put his nose against her shoulder. She raised one hand and rested it on his jaw without looking, the way you do with something familiar. She said, "You stayed in that corral all night with an animal every other man walked away from. That tells me something about you." I said, "Tells you I don't sleep well." She didn't smile exactly, but something shifted in her face. She said, "I've watched you for 2 years, Cord Hatcher. I know what kind of man you are. I came here this morning because I wanted to, not because the horse needed it." The water ran over our boots, and the cottonwoods moved, and above us, a red-tailed hawk crossed from one side of the sky to the other and didn't come back. I said, "Mrs. Calloway." She said, "June." I want to say what happened next was simple and fast, but it wasn't. Things rarely are when you're past a certain age and you have a history, and you've been alone long enough that being alone has become the shape your life takes. We were 2 careful people. We moved carefully. I came out to her place the following Sunday, and I fixed 3 fence posts that had been working loose along her north pasture. She fed me at noon. We talked for a long time after. I came back the next Sunday and the one after that, and the Sundays turned into some weekday afternoons. And by the time the first frost came in October, I had a clear picture in my mind of what her kitchen looked like in the morning light, and the sound her back door made when the wind was from the north, and the smell of the cedar she stacked near the porch. In November she said, one evening without preamble, "I think you should come live here." I said, "That's a serious thing to say." She said, "I'm a serious person." I said, "People will talk." She said, "People already talk about me. They've been talking about me for 3 years. I find I can bear it." She was sitting across the table from me, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, looking at me with those steady eyes. She had the look of a woman who has thought something through completely before she says it, who does not say things she doesn't mean. I said, "June." She said, "Yes." I said, "I'm 51 years old and my knee is bad, and I'm the marshal of a town that probably doesn't need a marshal anymore. I don't have much to offer." She set her cup down. She said, "You sat in that corral all night with a horse everybody else gave up on, and you did it because you couldn't leave a hurt thing alone. That's not nothing. That's not small. You think I don't know what I'm asking for?" She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Just laid it there. Her hand was warm and calloused on the palm from the fence work in the garden, and it was the realest thing I had felt in a long time. She said, "I'm not looking for someone young or rich or easy. I'm looking for someone true. I've been looking for a while." I turned my hand over under hers. "The horse healed. Price sold him to me in the spring for $12, which was less than he was worth even after everything. But Price felt some kind of obligation about it, and I didn't argue. I kept him at June's place. She named him Reed, for reasons I never fully understood, and he followed her around the yard like a dog. I gave up the rooms behind the office in December. The county commissioner was not sad to see me go, and I can't say the feeling wasn't mutual. I took the badge off one morning, set it on the desk, and walked out into a cold, clear day with the sun on the snow and the feeling, strange, not unpleasant, of a man who has put down something heavy and not yet felt the lightness that's coming. We married in February. Small. The preacher from the Methodist church and Delia from the boarding house, and Price, who cried, which none of us expected. June wore a dark blue dress and her hair was up, and she looked at me during the whole of the short ceremony with that direct, even gaze of hers, not nervous, not performing, just looking. The way she had looked at me that morning in the creek, kneeling in the cold water with her hands doing their careful work and her eyes saying what she had not yet said. When the preacher said the part about "for as long as you both shall live," I felt the weight of it without flinching. I was old enough to know what that meant. I had watched it mean something before and then stop. But I also knew, the way you know certain things about certain people, that June Calloway meant exactly what she said and no more and no less, and that she had come to that corral in the dark before dawn not because the horse needed tending, and not because she was a dutiful neighbor, but because she had looked at me for 2 years and made a decision and come to act on it. That's not a small thing to give a man. She put her hand in mine and we walked out of the church into the February cold, and Reed was tied to the post outside. She'd brought him, not telling me, and he blew a cloud of breath into the air and turned his long scarred shoulder toward us, and June laughed, a real laugh, sudden and clear, and I put my arm around her and held on. The sun was sharp on the snow. The mountains were white and very close. My knee ached the way it always does in the cold, and I didn't mind. This is what I have. This woman, this horse, this place with its cedar smoke and its creek running cold in the mornings and its north fence that always needs work. It's enough, more than enough. It's everything.